What's up, everybody? We're talking about all the student protests that are happening across the country, and we are going to take a look back at some important student protest moments and also talk about the reaction from politicians like Ronald Reagan. It all goes back to Ronald Reagan, just remember that. Led to the creation of tuition in California public schools, just to start with. But the response to student protests in the 60s and the 70s was to raise the cost of higher education to try and squash the working class from becoming educated. Because if there's something that the people in power in this country fear, it is the working class becoming educated, mobilizing, and joining in solidarity to protest and to say enough is enough to our tax dollars and our government officials sanctioning things like genocide. This is a student protester at UT Austin. He's talking about the police presence from the start, making it feel like a self-fulfilling prophecy, saying that UT Austin protesters had no intention of violence and wanted to exercise their 1A rights peacefully, but believe law enforcement and riot gear escalated the situation to where it's now about students versus police. Yes. And these administrators know that bringing in the police will always escalate the situation.
The police that never came, we would have followed the schedule set out by PSC. It was a variety of scholastic teach-ins, lunch breaks. It was, study hours on the lawn, a peaceful demonstration. And now that the police have come, it has now turned into like a clash of students wanting our own campus sovereignty and UT Austin and UTPD and state troopers trying to quell dissent.
I want to show you guys this. This is Columbia's own website. They have a page about how the last time they called for a mass arrest of student protesters, they were in the wrong and f***ed up their reputation for decades. This is in reference to what happened in 1968. That was when over 700 students were arrested and when the New York City police violently abused the student protesters. A couple days ago, when the students were arrested on Columbia's campus, that was the largest mass arrest since 1968. Columbia is a far different place today than it was in the spring of 1968 when protesters took over university buildings amid discontent about the Vietnam War, racism, and the university's proposed expansion into Morningside Park. After a week-long standoff, New York City police stormed the campus and arrested more than 700 people. The fallout dogged Columbia for years. It took decades for the university to recover from those turbulent times. Columbia now has one of the most socioeconomically diverse student bodies among its peer institutions. It has added a new campus designed to be open to the community and pursues fields of inquiry unheard of a half-century ago. Columbia is commemorating the 50th anniversary of those long-ago events with a deep dive of scholarship and exhibits chronicling what happened then and its effects today. The irony of this being on Columbia's website, saying, "Oh my God, Columbia, we've come so far. We are not the Columbia 1968 anymore. In fact, we're like totally cool and down with student protest. We encourage it. It's part of student culture. We're like, yes, Columbia students, we see you out there protesting." Really? Because it took 2 seconds for peaceful protesters to have the NYPD descend upon them. Okay, so let's watch this video from 1968.
The year was 1968. The Vietnam War raged on. Liberal uprisings took hold in Czechoslovakia. The civil rights movement intensified. Across the globe, people cried out for radical change. In the US, these cries rang out across many college campuses as students pushed for civil rights and demanded an end to the Vietnam War and the draft. These sentiments translated into activism and demonstrations.
When we are talking about how protests in the 60s led to public education charging tuition rates and then eventually, student debt becoming this thing that has crippled so many people in this country, that does stem back to Ronald Reagan.
Many of which ended in violence. Such was the case at Columbia University in April 1968. In February 1968, Columbia University began construction on an $11.6 million gymnasium in Morningside Park, part of the Harlem neighborhood that houses Columbia's main campus in New York City. Almost immediately, there was objection. Students and activists argued the gym discriminated against Harlem residents by evicting and displacing them to build the structure. The gym would be built with a main entrance that catered to students and university affiliates. But local Harlem residents, many of whom were black, could use part of the facilities but would have to enter through a back door in the basement. Many interpret this as segregation and racism. In 1967, one SDS member, Bob Feldman, found documents in the school library showing ties between the university and a think tank involved in weapons research for the U.S. Department of Defense, known as the Institute for Defense Analyses, or IDA. Many saw this as the university directly supporting the war in Vietnam. In the spring of 1968, the SDS, led by then-chairman Mark Rudd, organized a rally against the university. Their rallying cry? Students would not attend a university that exploited black people and developed weapons designed to kill the Vietnamese.
Okay, so what's interesting to note is in 1944, Franklin Roosevelt signed a GI Bill that included free college because academic and political leaders thought that most troops returning from World War II wouldn't be college material. So they're like, okay, we'll just throw that in there. At that time, about 5% of Americans were earning bachelor degrees. So hardly anyone in this country was seeking higher education. And in the 50s, there was a huge influx of people attending college that by 1960, it had gone from 5% to 31% of working class people now attending college. And so throughout the 50s and 60s, young people in this country realized that they wanted to go to college to develop a meaningful philosophy about life. And the American government did not anticipate that this would happen, but there was what we refer to as blowback, purposefully but accidentally providing a path for working class people to receive higher education. It actually made young people in this country much more critical of America. A lot of these young people looked at America's hypocrisy, America's ruthless militarism in Vietnam. They looked at the racial apartheid in the Deep South. They looked at all these issues that were going on and went, no, this. We are standing up against this. It's wild that the government was like, oh, we'll make college free for people coming back from war because they're not going to want to go to college. Like only 5% of people are obtaining higher education degrees right now. And yet the opposite happened and more people went to college. And the more and more that people got educated, the more that they learned meaningful philosophy on life. They turned around and looked at all the problems that surrounded them and realized the root causes of said problems. Learned how they were getting
On April 23, 1968, several hundred Columbia students gathered in front of Lowe Memorial Library, the university's main administrative building. They attempted to take their message inside to University President Grayson L. Kirk, but the administration locked the building down. So the group marched to the gymnasium construction site and tore down part of the fencing that surrounded it. The police moved to disperse the crowd, arresting one student in the process. Then protesters staged a sit-in at an administrative building, preventing Dean Henry Coleman from leaving his office. They presented a list of 6 demands. 2 included stopping construction on the gym and severing ties with the IDA. The students promised not to leave until their demands were met. The students eventually released Dean Coleman the next day, but their numbers had grown upwards of 400. They took over the Lowe Library and 3 additional buildings on campus. Students and community members sympathetic to the cause brought food and other supplies. The university tried to negotiate an end to the standoff over the next several days, but the administration refused to promise amnesty to the protesters, and no agreement was reached.
the
Over
music.
the course of the week, the numbers of protesters grew, until finally on April 30th, police, acting on orders from school president Kirk, moved in and forcefully cleared all 5 buildings. Amid the chaos, more than 100 students, faculty members, and police were injured, and 712 students were arrested. Motivated by the actions of the police, thousands of Columbia students went on strike, and the campus shut down for the rest of the semester. The university's June commencement ceremony was held off campus instead of at its traditional location on Lowe Plaza. More than 300 graduating students walked out in protest to hold their own counter-commencement ceremony. Eventually, Columbia University met the protesters' major demands. Gym construction was permanently suspended, and the school ended its relationship with the IDA.
Columbia has a long history with protest, as plenty of universities do. But I wanted to point this out because 1968, the administrator's response was so awful and really delegitimized them that they had to enact these reforms. And ever since then, have proudly advertised how much protest and activism is an innate part of student culture. And yet the way that the administrators and the president has acted this week is in direct contrast to that. They did not hesitate to once again bring the cops in, just like in 1968, and arrest hundreds of students en masse.
On May 4th, 1970, the Ohio National Guard opened fire on students protesting the Vietnam War, leaving 4 students dead.
This is a history video on the Kent
This tragedy,
State.
known as the Kent State Incident, further divided a
it's not
nation
as bad.
already torn over U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Young people who watched their friends, siblings, and peers being drafted were particularly active in demonstrating. And by 1970, U.S. involvement in Vietnam had actually begun to decrease. That is, until April 28th, when President Richard Nixon authorized a preemptive strike for troops to cross from South Vietnam into Cambodia.
Old Dick Nixon and our bestie, Henry Kissinger. They were like, oh, Vietnam wasn't enough. We're going into Cambodia.
2 days later, he made a televised speech justifying these actions. This triggered a new wave of anti-war demonstrations. On May 1st, the day after Nixon's announcement, 2 peaceful rallies were held at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. Later that night, drunken revelers in downtown began pushing over garbage cans, lighting fires, and breaking store windows. Police in riot gear pushed everyone back to campus, and the whole thing was over by 2:30 a.m. The next day, as students cleaned up the damage downtown, Kent Mayor Leroy Satrum declared a civil emergency and called in the Ohio National Guard, worried that violence would erupt again. By May 3rd, 1,200 National Guardsmen occupied the Kent State campus, so the students blocked traffic in protest. Some grew violent and were met with bayonets and tear gas. On May 4th, the governor banned demonstrations completely, distributing 12,000 leaflets prohibiting protests. But the students either didn't get the message or they didn't care. By noon, nearly 3,000 students had congregated in the university commons. That's when 100 guardsmen confronted the protesters with M1 rifles.
This is what they want to happen to the college campuses where students are protesting right now.
The general commanding the guard ordered the crowd to disperse from a jeep, but was met with chants and rock throwing. The guard retaliated with tear gas and advanced using bayonets on their rifles to push the crowd back. And it worked. The crowd dispersed. But then, as witnesses say, 28 of the guardsmen who had retreated up a hill fired between 61 and 67 shots, some in the air and some directly at the protesters. 4 students were killed. Victims Jeffrey Glenn Miller and Allison B. Krause were protesting, and William Knox Schroeder and Sandra Lee Scheuer, bystanders. People became more angered and vocal about the Vietnam War than ever before. Militant activism broke out across college campuses all over the country. On May 9th, 100,000 protesters demonstrated in front of the White House. But less than a week after the demonstration, a shooting occurred on another university campus. At Jackson State University in Mississippi, city and state police opened fire on a group of students, killing 2 and injuring 12.
People like Reagan were not just concerned about the hippies at Berkeley, they were also concerned that HBCUs were rising in attendance rates.
These tragedies may have spurred anti-war activism, but the resulting protest also provoked a counter-movement from conservatives and a surge in patriotism. Some argue that this reaction from those who disagreed with the protesters, often called the silent majority, handed Nixon the presidency in 1972.
Let's talk about Ronald Reagan now. The shooting at Kent State came after years throughout the 60s of youth-led protests at universities like Berkeley and Columbia, and it created a panic with conservative lawmakers who did not like seeing the youths become educated and start challenging the status quo. And remember, higher education had been treated as a public good for about 100 years before it was made unaffordable and inaccessible to any young person wanting to attend college. Politicians like Ronald Reagan realized that they had to put an end, or at least start to put an end to higher education being available and accessible for anybody in this country. And that's how we got the privatization of the American way of college. That's how taxpayer support for public universities was radically reduced. That's how tuition rose every single year, and until it's gotten to a point that it's not affordable at all. And if you decide to go to college, you're going to be drowning in debt.
In the United States, over 43 million people hold student loan debt, with the average debt holder having about $39,000. That's a staggering amount. The total student debt in the US is over $1.5 trillion.
And this relates, of course, I mean, we're talking about how this led to tuition at public universities and how it's led to college being the for-profit system that is today. But something that's been pissing me off is when I see people commenting on these protesters and being like, oh, boo-hoo, paying $90,000 a year, like privileged crybaby. And I'm thinking to myself, privileged crybaby? No, the opposite. These students are paying $90,000 a year because of politicians like Ronald Reagan, who looked at the protests of the 60s, who looked at the growing liberal philosophy mindsets of students attending higher education and went, no, gotta change this. And that has led to the student debt crisis today. And these students are looking at their universities that are essentially hedge funds now for private equity firms. And they're seeing the billion-dollar businesses their universities have become, and they're seeing the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars of student debt that they have. They're seeing how the endowment that universities like Harvard, Yale, and Columbia are receiving are going to fund genocide and are not going to alleviate some of this student debt that they're so saddled with, that it's not like actually making housing on campus affordable, and they're pissed off, and rightfully so. Actually, your attitude towards students who are paying $90,000 a year at places like Columbia should be, yeah, these students absolutely are morally correct in protesting, not just because funding a genocide is evil as but because of everything that I just mentioned.
That's more than the total US auto debt or the total US medical debt. And if I've learned anything in my time as a public policy researcher, if something in America is going really wrong, it's always a safe bet to blame Ronald Reagan.
I know we joke about this, and I know it's kind of a meme, but it's also true. And you don't have to know every single thing about politics, and you don't have to know about the history of politics in this country to just think of a problem, okay? And it's pretty safe to assume that you can trace it back. Like a problem that exists today, you can trace it back to Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan and many other right-wing presidents did not have a good relationship with college students or college faculty. He held a particular distaste for the campus activism that was reaching its peak in the late 60s during his run for governor of California. On the campaign trail, he did his very best to paint campus protests about the draft, the war in Vietnam, and civil rights as illegitimate. He considered these the actions of beatniks, anarchists, and filthy speech advocates who simply wanted to riot and cause chaos.
Ronald Reagan, when he was elected governor, one of the things that he ran on, and then one of the things that he continued to push as he was governor of California, he talked about the new hippie who looks like Tarzan, walks like Jane, and smells like cheetah. Reagan, of course, came after Nixon, who referred to student protesters as bums. And then Reagan just took it a step further in really villainizing students at universities like Berkeley, like bringing back the dirty hippie thing. In 1967, he convinced the University Board of Berkeley to fire its president, Clark Kerr. That happened in 1967. And then in 1969, he claimed falsely, Ronald Reagan claimed that Negroes had threatened a university dean with switchblades at his throat, forcing him to admit them to courses. This was unsubstantiated, like a lot of Reagan's claims, but it received a ton of press coverage, and it led to the fear-mongering that the media was responsible for disseminating, that like what was happening at these college campuses was out of control. Where have I heard that before?
This wasn't about academic freedom and integrity or the preservation of civil liberties. This was about moral decency and the character of a nation. All of this language should sound familiar to you. This is the Reagan playbook.
That interest is because this generation, these young people, have been indoctrinated. They have been hammered throughout their lifetime.
The Reagan playbook.
With the idea of the all-important security.
You look at the political climate today, you look at the way that politicians talk about law and order, it all comes from Ronald Reagan. They are still following the Ronald Reagan playbook today.
When he ran for governor, he used it when he ran for president, and Republicans have been pulling from this playbook for decades now. So when Ronald Reagan became the governor of California, he went on the attack. He cut California state funding for public higher education, started to set the precedent for public universities to shift to a tuition-based model, and he even went as far as to bring the National Guard in to quash student protests. He was able to do this because he moved the public discourse on higher education. Rather than seeing access to higher education as a national asset, he framed universities as a problem. Unpatriotic institutions, welfare queens that drained public funds, practically socialism. Under his tenure, not only did they cut state funding for public universities, but they also changed laws allowing higher fees to be assessed from students in order to make up for budget shortfalls. And to further bridge the artificially created budget gap, they let colleges take in greater numbers of out-of-state students who were expected to pay higher fees. After his tenure as governor, Reagan continued his assault of public education as president. Overall grants to support education decreased, and federal guidance around student loan initiatives started to take shape. Reagan was successful. He rebranded public institutions as wasteful, debt-generating welfare queens, even though it's been clear for decades that investments in public universities and higher education pay dividends. It boosts the economy, creates jobs and innovation, and allows for more social mobility.
Yeah, and you want to know who Reagan was really popular with? Because what he did by successfully curbing access to higher education for all people in this country who wanted it, he didn't reduce protest or left-wing views on college campuses, no. But he did become very popular with older white voters who had not gone to college. The youth of this country who he was targeting, they just became more radicalized. Isn't that interesting how that happens? But Reagan was incredibly popular with older white voters who were like, yeah, damn straight, college is evil. College turns the youth in this country into communist hippies. Look at all these black people going to college. We can't have them taken over.
So the next time you're wondering why you have so much student loan debt, remember that you have Ronald Reagan to blame.
Yeah, and you know who also doesn't like college protesters or is not doing anything to support college protesters? Who today signed the bill to ban TikTok. I need someone to present an argument that will contrast my belief that the Democrats do not want to win. I don't know how the Democrats, like, what's the plan for winning here when this is what you're doing? The election is in November. Joe Biden just keeps doing everything to piss off young people in this country.